I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Karmen MacKendrick, author of Failing Desire, a book that I guarantee will change the way you think of not only failure, but concepts of shame, autonomy, truth, writing. It's a really interesting book. If you want to check out what Karmen's reading and recommends that you read as well, don't forget tinapp.org has recommendations from all of our guests. Thank you so much for being on the show, Karmen. Maybe we could begin with what attracted you to this concept that I think a lot of other academics and just other people would tend to shy away from. Issues of shame, issues of failure. These are not things that I'm comfortable necessarily talking about, and I know that many of us have been sort of trained not to talk about this kind of thing. How did you get started?
I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is that my very first work dealt with paradoxical pleasures, with pleasures that seemed to include pain or that one wouldn't necessarily think of as pleasurable, such as those of asceticism. And among the responses that I received was one complaining that I hadn't dealt with shame or humiliation. My response at the time was, well, maybe someone else could do that, but eventually that caught up with me. So that was part of it, just a feeling that there was some unfinished work there. But there actually are some connections to the work that I'd done in between those two. That book actually came out in 1999, so obviously there's quite a gap there. I'm always fascinated with what seems to lie just at the edge of or just outside of what we can really grasp intellectually, and how it is that we feel nonetheless compelled to try to talk about that or experience it or reach and transmit or communicate it in some way.
And why do you think it is that people don't generally talk about or want to talk about shame and humiliation? I mean, it seems sort of obvious that these are things that you should avoid in conversation on a typical day-to-day basis, but why is that? And how have you found talking about that among maybe peers, colleagues, people who are interested in the work that you're doing?
I suspect one reason is just that we get enough of it. But one of the things that makes them interesting as a paradox or as something that is very difficult to discuss conceptually as well as effectively, they do seem to lie at this limit of what's discussable or graspable. So that's probably part of it, although a fairly small part. I think it's simply the fact that these are painful and difficult things that makes them interesting as a thing that we might try for or approach or even find pleasure in. But that painful and difficult side also makes this something that we're pretty reluctant to bring up in conversation. So I guess that combination of being intellectually or conceptually difficult to say, but also being affectively painful or unpleasant, keeps this out of a lot of conversation.
What made you feel that it was important that we do talk about it, despite these either taboos in some circles or just difficulties in others? Why is it important to think about and critically reflect on shame and this concept of failing desire?
I have a flippant answer, which is that I'm never sure that what I'm doing is important. I often feel drawn to write things almost as if there's not a whole lot of choice in the matter. But a more serious response would be that, again, going back to that first book, Counter Pleasures from 99, I didn't expect all of the reactions that I got, especially all of the positive responses. I remember particularly a minister who came up to me after one of the very first talks that I'd done on that and told me that he had always said to his congregation, which was primarily a queer congregation, that practices of SM or playing with power were abusive and things that one really needed to avoid, and if one was drawn to them, that one needed to figure out a way to get away from that. And that after hearing me, he was interested in rethinking that position. And that seemed like something that could possibly be actually valuable in people's lives in allowing them a greater range of pleasures and allowing them, if they were going to feel guilt, at least to have it a kind of guilt that they could have fun with, rather than something that was simply miserable. But because I knew that I had left shame and humiliation and the kinds of complicated pleasures that people might draw out of that first discussion, I did feel that it might be important for that reason to return to this. That also made this book incredibly difficult to write, because usually I feel that I owe my readers the best thinking and research and writing that I can give them. But here I also felt that I had a sort of ethical or even political obligation that I don't always feel, and I'm very nervous about those things. And so I think that delayed the writing of this text quite a bit as well.
I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about the political nature of it, because it's interesting in a number of ways. I mean, I've noticed that myself and probably other people too, in the last few years, especially politically, especially in America, have been thinking or rethinking about politics and potentially desire, but definitely failure or disappointment. And these kinds of concepts, I think, have become more prominent, especially in the left. But you don't necessarily talk about politics in the sense of like federal politics, or although there's obvious implications. Where do you see the political nature of this work?
I think that it's political at a much smaller level, but those smaller levels, as you well know, tend to build up and to resonate at a larger level as well. I've been writing recently, not in a large project, but in a number of smaller ones, conference papers, small journal publications, and so on, about the problems with our desire to measure and quantify absolutely everything, from both what we think of as the individual subject with all of the problems that has, on through to the level of populations. That seems to me problematic, not only because it doesn't work, but because it shuts off or at least reduces so many possibilities. So I've been concerned with that educationally, for instance. Our desire to have learning outcomes that are established in advance and quantified runs contrary to everything that's good and fascinating about the humanities, that possibility of wonder and of opening up onto the unexpected. And I think that sense of the immeasurable and unexpected about both each of us, insofar again as you can say that, and about us in interaction and in groups, is something that inherently resists some of the possibilities of measuring and categorizing and therefore governing us. So although it doesn't translate in a particularly obvious way to some of the larger modes of resistance that are so urgent now, I do think that understanding knowledge and quantifiability in this way does necessarily play into those more obvious modes of resistance as well.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about this work is that you seem to easily go from quoting scripture or ancient religious texts to, at one point, quoting someone. I believe you're quoting a different author talking about Penthouse.
Yes.
Talking about S&M, basically a lot of things that would make people blush.
Yes.
I mean, those are the two extremes, I would say, of the kinds of sources you're using. How do you negotiate these sources and choose them and put them together in a way that seems to work so, I mean, it comes across effortlessly, but I'm sure it also includes some tension.
Right. I like tensions. I think that's part of it. And I think from my earliest work, but including just about everything I've done that has any intersection with religion or theology, I've been interested in the possibilities that those texts present for not being well-behaved or not working with the most common or most widely received readings. There's so much in the history of Christianity, even though our common perception of it is that it's against bodies, it's against women, it's against anybody having any fun. There is so much in the history of it that works otherwise. And I've been drawn to that for a long time. I actually didn't think of myself as doing theology or religious philosophy until other people told me that that's what I was doing. And then I found that there are a lot of people doing very interesting work in queer theology. So I think for me, those juxtapositions seem a little more natural than they probably do to others. But there's also a kind of intentional mischievousness in those juxtapositions, not only because they do seem to work for me, but because I really want to draw other people's attention to the fact that in these texts that are so often used oppressively, there are some very different possibilities.
I've noticed that you have a lot of really interesting epigrams or quotations that start off a lot of the subjects. They range from, again, quoting, I think, the Bible and religious texts, but also quoting, I believe, Game of Thrones, David Lynch, Bob Dylan. Yeah, I'm curious where they come from because these are also incredibly diverse.
I actually keep a running list as a project is developing of lines or short passages that seem to me to be especially resonant with some of what I want to say, but that might not work as a citation within the text. They just seem different, I guess. Things that I might otherwise have written in the margins, maybe if this were a text that I was reading. Those do tend to be quite diverse. Part of the reason for that diversity is that some of them do come out of chance encounters. The other is that I am hoping at a more intentional level to use those to open up, again, a kind of resonance for my readers. And I want those to be wide-ranging. It's exciting to me to make connections. I think when I teach, one of the most exciting things that happens is that some of my students who had never seen before how topics can go together, especially ancient or medieval and contemporary topics, will start to see those connections emerge. And so I think seeing the connections between popular culture or the kind of marginal subcultures and things that might be more familiar to them, especially because I do teach at a Catholic school, from scripture or from religious texts, to see how the ways in which those go together start to emerge is kind of exciting for me. And so I'm hoping that it will be exciting for others as well. And I'm sorry that last sentence completely got out of my grammatical control.
No, it's interesting to hear how you do that and the collecting of it. I'm wondering, when you set out to write this, did you have a clear notion of shame and humiliation and these related concepts that you use? Or were they sort of amorphous and then they maybe crystallized as you were writing?
They definitely changed. I never know what I'm writing until I've written it. There will always be a part of the process in which I think, oh, okay, now I know. And it always turns out that that was wrong. So I start out generally with an intuition that there are some things that need to go together, such as the concepts of shame and humiliation and knowing and the secret, that which seems to pull at knowledge without quite being known. In this case, I felt that those concepts, those things had to go together in some way, but I never quite know what that way is. And so I struggle through quite a few drafts before I start to see what that way might be. And in doing that, the concepts themselves invariably change as well. So there's really very little sense of knowing in advance. It makes writing frustrating and difficult, but I think that's also what keeps it interesting. There's a line in one of Foucault's interviews in which an interviewer asks him why the project that he had presented as what he was going to do in the history of sexuality had changed so much from its original presentation. And he said something like, it's very boring to write if you know what you're going to do. I think that I feel that as well. I get bored pretty easily. So at least that keeps me from boredom, even if I'm often a little terrified at the same time.
When you were writing, did you plan out the structure? I mean, right now the structure is basically that the first chapter is about failure in writing, and then it goes to failure in autonomy, and then speech, and then sight and flesh, and then you conclude with a failure to conclude. Did you break it down there, or did these sort of emerge as well as you began writing?
Those emerged. In part it was as I began writing, and in part it was the fact that in a few cases I had been asked to write a piece for some particular purpose, for a conference or a publication. Those gave me a particular site, S-I-T-E, to hold on to. That's particularly true for the chapter on confession. In others, it was more of a set of concepts that ended up being dispersed across chapters. For instance, there was a piece I did for a book called Pornotopias several years ago that gave me some thoughts about humiliation and secrecy, but they didn't end up being a particular chapter. So some of them emerged as I went, but certainly the idea of that structure was not established in advance. That's also something else that tends to emerge very slowly as I go along.
You use a number of different theorists, I would say, again, ranging from, in some cases, religious scholars to more contemporary queer theorists. Of course, Foucault and Derrida and similar theorists come up in your book. Do you see yourself as following any one of them in terms of how you're approaching the knowledge that you're gaining and that you're generating? Some people could easily see a Derridian like deconstruction. Others, I think, could see a sort of archaeology or genealogy, Foucauldian one. Do you see yourself doing something like that, or not as specific?
I think it's not as specific. I think I am not a very good critical reader. That is, I'm not good at reading texts and seeing what is problematic in them or what's wrong with them. That makes me not a great philosopher. That may be one reason that I've ended up being more at home in theology. I do like to look at a lot of different writers, a lot of different theorists, and find what it is in their work that really appeals to me, gives me ideas, makes me think about new ways to approach some subject. So I think that my approach really is pretty eclectic, rather than being particularly indebted to one thinker or another.
I'm not sure if you had a specific goal in writing this other than to explore these concepts, but I'm curious, if you did have a goal, how did you see it? Or even if it wasn't a specifically phrased goal or something, what did you see as the purpose of writing this? And then did you fail at this? Because it seems like you almost, well, according to what you've written in the book, right? You have to basically at some point fail in doing this, in putting these words down, in getting these ideas across. Something is always going to be lost. There's always going to be a remainder. Seems to be a crux of the book.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about how you fit into that as author?
I can at least try. I'll probably fail at that as well. I think that sometimes I begin with a goal, but the goal does tend, again, to be somewhat amorphous. That is, I want to see how these things are going to work together. One of the I guess one of the intersections that emerged in this that especially fascinated me was the one to which you've just referred. That is, if I set failure as a goal, then I've put myself into a paradoxical position, because either I failed to reach it, so in some sense I've succeeded at failing, or I succeed in reaching it, in which case I've failed at failing. And paradoxes and impossible goals really intrigue me. And again, I think that there's some sense in all of these modes of failure, all of these modes of shame, of humiliating oneself or of being humiliated, to know oneself. I guess it's kind of a failure of philosophy at its basis. It's Socratic know thyself basis. In that sense, I think that I failed, but I hope that maybe I have succeeded in saying a little bit about why failure isn't purely a negative. There's another sense in which, for me, there's always a remainder, and that is a great deal of my writing comes out of what I feel I failed to accomplish in the last thing I did or in what I've done so far. That sense, I think, in that sense too, failure isn't simply a bad thing. So maybe it's okay if I've succeeded in that much, even though I have failed to present a complete theory or an absolutely coherent theory of what failure is, or of what knowledge is, or of what this can do politically.
It can be, as you said, a sort of liberating understanding. And I think it's interesting that once you start looking into these concepts, at least for me, writing, autonomy, speech, confession, these are all things that seem, on the surface very obvious and very easy to understand.
Yes.
Really, in pushing them to the limit, I think I realized my failure to understand them, which is an interesting thing because at first it's very uncomfortable because you would like to say, I understand what autonomy means and I have it, or I'm getting closer to it or something. But then with these limits or with these sort of extremes that then become paradoxes, I think that we realize a lot of this, which seems to me that a lot of scholarship in general is just all about failing.
I think that's a really nice way to put it. There is both a desire to understand, to have a sense of mastery over these subjects, and the sense, as you pursue them, that not only are they going to elude mastery, but that they're going to suggest to you that that's actually something completely unattainable, whether it's over these topics or even over oneself, certainly over one's world. For me, there's both a sense in which it might be good for us to become more comfortable with that, but also a sense that we have to retain the value of that discomfort.
Do you see any ways in which this can be used? I don't necessarily want to instrumentalize this concept because it's definitely not what you're suggesting. Mm-hmm. But once we understand, or once we start to think about these limits of, definitely limits of mastery, but also these potentials in failure, is there a way in which you think that we might be able to do scholarship, maybe at least in the humanities, arts and humanities, in a better way? I don't want to get into that thing about failing better because as you bring up, it's an interesting quote that everybody uses, but probably not in the way that it was intended. Taking on this concept seems to change a lot because the presentation of mastery seems to be inherent in most educational systems, whereas perhaps what we should be doing to some extent is demonstrating failure. But of course, that's not something that I think a lot of people are going to vote for or that the curriculum committees are going to approve of. How do you think this can be used, though, in a general way in scholarship?
I think that this does tie into my worries about making all education, certainly college education, but I see it in the preparation from high schools that our students bring to us as well, into something that can be tested and measured, and we can assign numerical values to how well the students have mastered particular skills. What I particularly value in education isn't perhaps directly a sense of failure, but it's a sense of incompletion, at least, a sense that we can go off on tangents and that there's always going to be more to learn about something, and that maybe what you thought you were doing in studying a particular text or topic is actually quite different than you had thought at the beginning. And a willingness to explore those things, to say, wait, this is different, or maybe we want to read that instead, or let's stop and spend a few days on this topic that came up unexpectedly from my students. Those things really don't have a place in learning assessment or outcomes evaluations. I don't think we can give them a place in that. And so maybe to resist in the humanities as strongly as we can a sense that we must quantify everything, is really important for some of the reasons that I try to raise about failure here, but also for the very existence of the humanities, for suggesting that they're not just poorly done sciences, but actually something valuable on their own.
Do you see a place for that expanding beyond the humanities as well, or is this something that potentially is unique to the liberal arts?
I think it's most obvious in the humanities. One point, though, that I do often make when I'm trying to persuade my students of this after all of their years of learning how to take tests well, to a considerable extent, this is how the natural sciences work as well. You have to be open to the possibility of failure if you're actually doing science. That sense of the unexpected and different seems to me to go necessarily with a failure to master, to be complete, to be in control. It's to really let the material lead you in some ways. And so, although I think that the humanities maybe have a more explicit history in this respect, that they do exist in other disciplines as well.
One of the paradoxes that you don't necessarily touch on specifically here, but it made me think of discourses that I've read in other books about different generational approaches. You'll have a lot of catchphrases like the millennials and the me generation and the baby boomers and all of these things that may or may not be sort of realistic, but definitely color expectations. A lot of the complaint of the newest sort of generation hitting college and university these days is that there is a sort of lack of shame, where earlier generations, I guess, could arguably be raised to feel shame if they fail to do something right, to feel shame if they haven't gotten an A on a paper or something. Whereas newer generations, for whatever reason, seem, by some arguments, not to feel shame in that they don't feel bad when they can't do things. It's a completely sort of different set of expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that? And do you see that playing into some of the things that you've looked at in other areas?
Oh, nice question. I certainly see some differences, especially the sense of privacy and interiority seems to me to have changed and to be changing very rapidly. Some of that seems alarming to me, the way it does to most old people, in that one sort of wonders, are you really going to want that on Facebook forever or on whatever emerging social medium it might be? But it also seems to me that there are some really interesting possibilities there for a sense of subject boundaries, that there isn't a sense so much of self-containment, and that there is perhaps a greater sense of community, and I want to say intersubjectivity, but that sort of implies that you start with discrete subjects that then connect. So something even more open and more fluid than that. I think there's promise there. I don't actually find that there is much less drive to succeed among my students. That is, they're still every bit as concerned about grades as anyone has been before. So I'm not sure if that kind of failure has become more acceptable.
Well, I think failure in the testing culture, just to clarify, like the testing culture definitely creates a sense of shame based on the numbers or what have you.
Right.
The grade you get would definitely be a source of shame for students that have been raised on these standardized tests. But the achievement or the skill sets or whatever don't seem to be a source of shame. So, for example, if somebody doesn't know how to spell something, earlier generations may feel shame. And I hear a lot of professors, maybe not a lot, but I've heard a few say something like, if I didn't know how to do this, or if I hadn't read whatever, I would feel bad or I would feel shame. Whereas newer students don't seem to feel shame at the knowledge or at the skill sets, but definitely in terms of the numerical outcome.
Okay, yeah, I think that's quite accurate. And that may have to do with the fact that that's what's presented as valuable. As long as you've got the score on the test at the end of the year, or the end of the semester, that's what matters. It's what matters to the educational system. I would be interested, I think, in knowledge not so much as a possession of facts and a shame over whether one possesses that kind of knowledge or not, but as a source of delight, which would move away from both the shame of not knowing and the shame of not scoring highly. So in that sense, I guess I would be interested in not being shamed or not being ashamed in pedagogy, but rather being willing to accept incompletion and limitation and moving on. One thing that interests and puzzles me, for which I don't have a good answer, is that if we really do culturally move away from shame and from humiliation and from a sense of failure at something that we were trying hard to accomplish, what kinds of sort of subversive pleasures might we lose? It's very uncomfortable to me to suggest that those things might be worth holding on to for the pleasure of them, because of course those are not pleasures one's supposed to have.
I guess one thing that to some extent worries me, I guess, when thinking about that is, and you mentioned in the book as well, right? Vulnerable populations, vulnerable subjects are more likely to experience shame and humiliation, and to argue that there's a sort of secret or subversive pleasure in humiliation seems to put the onus, or maybe not the onus, but it seems to dissipate the power structures at play in our societies. So how do you, because I'm sure that you're not advocating for that kind of structural disenfranchisement, but how do you separate that and saying, looking for equality among subjects, but also possibly exploring a pleasure in shame and humiliation?
That's a very difficult intersection, and I think a dangerous one, but in, again, that sort of Foucauldian sense that not all danger is bad. It's certainly something of which to be aware, though. I've struggled with this question for a while, and talking to Kent Brentnell, who wrote one of the blurbs on the book, who was one of the reviewers for this, has helped me quite a bit, trying to figure out why it did seem to me that valuing these kinds of pleasures could still be important. And that is, culturally, we still put on top the very contained, masterful and self-mastered subject, the autonomous, the strong, and so on. As long as that is our ideal, it may make some sense to try to argue against it. Not to say that it's great if some people are shamed and humiliated, but simply to say, well, maybe you, because you are there in this master position, aren't actually all that we've thought. So that's one possibility. But the other is that there is what may be an irresolvable risk and tension here, in that I think for these pleasures and for the sort of SM and ascetic pleasures that I looked at many years ago as well, you have to start at a place at which consent does make sense, which means that you do have to start with a kind of subjectivity, even though you're interested in going beyond that. I think if you don't start with that, then the value of going beyond that isn't a value. It's just more oppression, more crushing underfoot. But I remain unsure, and I'm not certain that there will ever be a way for me as to how to resolve that tension, how to figure out if one can really make sense of starting in a place that you say is very important, and yet at the same time saying that it's important to get beyond that.
Definitely one of the interesting things about each chapter is the way that you sort of maintain a tension, especially between sort of taken for granted notions and pushing them to an extreme. I'm curious if you could say maybe a little bit more about autonomy, since you started to at least talk about the subject.
Yes.
Especially with S&M, which I don't know that much about. And so, yeah, if I'm saying anything off, just please correct it. But the idea that you would give up autonomy seems to not actually work because you are the one giving it up.
Right.
So in other words, it seems to be a paradox to say that I choose not to choose, or these kinds of things. So in that circumstance, it's an interesting sort of case study, but then it seems to be something we also do, even actually on social media, right? When we're saying that we give up our autonomy to, for ownership or to work with whatever program we're using, we give up everything, but then we sort of don't, or at least we don't feel like it. And so there's this there's this tension between, are you actually, I mean, maybe you could just say a bit about how you envision autonomy working.
I think that tension, am I giving this up or not, is something that asceticism, in especially monastic settings of the sort that I tried to explore here, and SM both use quite deliberately, whether or not it's explicit or at a consciously intentional level. Mm-hmm. That is, because there's a paradox here, because I can't give it up entirely, and because, as you suggested, as soon as I say, well, I choose not to choose, I've chosen that, mm-hmm. that allows one to keep pushing, to keep building the intensity. That's what builds the impossibility into it, keeps it from ever becoming success, or at a more mundane level, from ever becoming boring. So autonomy in the sense of self-mastery, of literally making my own laws, deciding what I will do, and following through on them without requiring input from anyone else, is in some sense impossible for anyone. We simply don't live in isolation, but is something that you can also deliberately manipulate or play with in these particular contexts. And that seems to me to illuminate the paradoxes of it in ways that I just find fascinating. I'm not sure I have a deeper justification for them.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this connects or not, but playing on the title of your book, Failing Desire, it seems to be, to some extent, like an oxymoron, right? Because you want to succeed, and so there's a possibility of failing to do what you want, what you desire to do, but there's also the possibility of desiring failure, as you note. And so it seems like these are two sides maybe of a coin. And I'm wondering what you started with conceptually and how you thought through it. Were you thinking of desire and then thinking about how that works within the context of failure? Or were you maybe thinking about failure and then asking how that plays out in the context of desire? Or was there a different kind of combination?
For once, I actually have a fairly straightforward answer. I've worked on desire in most of what I've done. It's, in fact, a big part of my dissertation topic, going even that far back. So I definitely started with desire. I've been interested for a long time in the kinds of desires that are not fulfillable or are not simply fulfillable, that don't seem to work on the model of satiation, like hunger, or simple release along a kind of Freudian model in which you would only build up tension for the purpose of pleasurably getting rid of it. So I think that it was an interest in desire, the ways in which it doesn't seem to be entirely satisfiable, that led me to the question of what happens if you're seeking not to have it satisfied. Does that work if there's not also a desire for satisfaction? How do those two poles make success impossible? That then led me into questions of failure. So desire was certainly the starting point there.
As you said, most scholarship continues from things that you hadn't quite done in previous work. What do you want to do now, or what are you working on now, perhaps, that you didn't quite get to in this book?
The project I'm working on now, at first, is not going to sound as if it's at all related to this, but there actually is a fairly close tie. One of the things that intrigued me and that I was only able to superficially explore in this book on failure was the ways in which materiality itself seems resistant to knowledge, not just because we don't know yet, but because there is something there that is other than knowable. And so I've been going back, oddly enough, to some Gnostic texts, to mystical traditions in especially Christianity and Judaism, a little bit in Sufism as well, to ask whether there is some mystery, which closely resembles the secret in the work on failure, to materiality itself. So although they sound incredibly different, that's actually the place that the remainder from that particular book has taken me.
I guess just to follow up on that, what are you hoping to produce? Are you working on the next book, or is this a smaller project, or how do you see it shaping up?
This one is a book project. At the moment, it seems to be sort of coordinating itself around three kinds of human or humanoid bodies, but those bodies open up onto matter generally. So there's a kind of primal human body, the body of certain explorations of Adam in the book of Genesis. There's the crucified and risen body of Christ as explored in some marginal Christian texts, and then the risen body that you find in early Christianity, which becomes just marvelously weird and excessive. But all of those play into, for instance, the idea of microcosm and macrocosm that I've been looking at. For instance, the idea of a fractal world in which everything is contained in the most microscopic or the tiniest element of everything else. The other way in which the text seems to be organizing itself is in relation to current explorations of materiality, particularly in new materialism and in object-oriented ontology, which fascinate me by being so resistant to theology. So again, there's a kind of mischievous desire to bring these things that seem to oppose each other into conversation.
I'm sure that I have failed to mention or to ask all of the questions that I should, and I apologize for that. Is there anything that you were thinking about during this that we didn't get to yet?
Actually, there's not. You've done a remarkably good job of covering the things that I thought were important. So yes, I think I failed to have further suggestions.
Well, thank you then for speaking to me today, Karmen. And I really find that this work is outside of my own personal knowledge base. And so I was not hesitant, but I wasn't as comfortable, I guess, with the material. But I think that can, as I've learned from this book, be also a good thing in that it's pushing myself to failure, perhaps in a productive way that will continue conversations. And I'm sure anyone else reading this will be able to continue this and maybe pick up on some of these remainders. And so it's a really interesting background for anybody who's not doing this specific work. And of course, it's a really great book for those who are doing more nuanced work on either religious studies, queer theory, or the combination of which is interesting, really interesting stuff. So thank you so much for speaking to me today.
Well, thank you. This has been really engaging, and you seem to be a superb reader, which I really appreciate.
As always, thank you so much for listening and supporting the podcast. Thanks especially to those of you who have emailed with recommendations and ideas. I encourage anyone who's listening to do that kind of thing. Let me know what books you're interested in hearing about. Let me know what authors you're interested in. And of course, if you want to buy some stickers on our website or check out some of those books, couldn't recommend that enough. If you are listening on iTunes, Google Play Music, or any of those things, please, if you like what you're hearing, leave a review. That's how other people get to hear about this. Thanks again.